The first time she realized her parents were trying to erase her, it was not through shouting or slammed doors, but through silence. A calculated, rehearsed silence that followed her into every room like a shadow. By the time she understood the depth of it, the narrative had already been planted. She was unstable, fragile, unpredictable. And everyone believed it. Elena had always been the quiet one in the family. Not weak, not dramatic, just observant. She noticed how her mother's smile tightened when relatives praised her independence. She noticed how her father's compliments felt rehearsed, as if spoken for an audience rather than from the heart. But she never imagined that those subtle shifts would evolve into something strategic. It began after her grandmother's health declined. The old house, heavy with the scent of lavender and old wood, carried the unspoken promise of inheritance. Elena had been the one who visited most often, who organized medications, who sat beside the bed during long, restless nights. Yet at family gatherings, her parents began to tell a different story. They spoke gently, sorrowfully about Elena's episodes, about her emotional instability, about how difficult it had become to rely on her. At first, she thought it was a misunderstanding. Then she saw the emails, concerned messages sent to distant relatives, careful descriptions of supposed mood swings, subtle suggestions that Elena was not capable of managing her own life, let alone caring for an elderly woman or handling an estate. Each word crafted with clinical precision. Not accusations, concerns. Not lies, distortions. The humiliation reached its peak at her cousin's anniversary dinner. Surrounded by polished silverware and soft candlelight, she felt the room shift when her father placed a steadying hand on her shoulder, as if bracing her for something only he could see. Conversations paused when she approached. Eyes softened with pity. Her mother's voice floated across the table, gentle and apologetic, explaining Elena's condition, as though discussing the weather. Elena did not argue. She did not cry. She simply sat there, her silence mistaken for proof. Within weeks, legal papers surfaced. A petition suggesting that guardianship might be necessary. For her own protection, they claimed. There were murmurs about safeguarding the inheritance from poor decisions. Her world narrowed into documents, whispered phone calls, and the slow realization that the people who had raised her were constructing a cage around her name. But what her parents had not anticipated was that the court would require an independent psychiatric evaluation. And what Elena knew, deep in her steady, unshaken mind, was that truth has a peculiar way of resisting performance. The hearing date was set. And for the first time since the rumors began, Elena felt something shift, not fear but resolve. The real battle had not yet begun. The courthouse stood like a monument to permanence, its pale stone facade indifferent to family feuds and whispered betrayals. Elena paused at the base of the steps, steadying her breath as autumn wind curled around her coat. The air felt sharp, almost cleansing. Inside those walls, the story her parents had carefully constructed would be examined under fluorescent lights and legal scrutiny. For weeks, she had lived inside their version of her, fragile, unstable, erratic. Today, she would step into her own. The waiting area was sterile and bright, lined with plastic chairs and muted conversations. Her parents sat across the room, close together, their posture united, composed. Her mother's face carried an expression of sorrow polished to perfection. Her father kept his gaze forward, as if burdened by responsibility rather than accusation. To an outsider, they were devoted parents enduring a painful necessity. Elena felt the weight of watching eyes. Distant relatives, a family friend, even the neighbor who had once borrowed sugar and now avoided her gaze. Witnesses to a story she had never told. The court-appointed psychiatrist had already met with her twice. The sessions were thorough, clinical, and unsettling in their intensity. He had asked about childhood, about memory, about perception. He had watched not just what she said, but how she said it. The questions had probed gently but persistently, searching for cracks in logic, for instability in thought patterns. Elena had answered calmly, aware that every pause might be interpreted, every emotion dissected. She had expected to feel defensive. Instead, she felt exposed. Not because she feared being found unstable, but because she understood how easily truth could be reframed when filtered through doubt. Her parents' lawyer presented documents first, emails, printed messages, anecdotal testimonies. Phrases like concerning behavior and erratic decisions floated through the courtroom like invisible smoke. Each example was small on its own. A forgotten appointment, a tearful evening after an argument, a sudden decision to take unpaid leave to care for her grandmother. Ordinary human moments rearranged into evidence of fragility. Elena listened without interruption, her silence again mistaken for weakness. Then came the mention of inheritance. Subtle, almost reluctant. The suggestion that granting Elena full control over her grandmother's estate might place her under undue stress. The implication was clear. Protection required distance. Distance required legal authority. And legal authority required declaring her incapable. When her name was called, she rose with measured steps. She felt the room tilt toward her. Her voice, when she spoke, remained steady. She described her routines, her responsibilities, her work history. She recounted caring for her grandmother with detail and clarity. There was no trembling, no confusion, only precision. Still, doubt lingered in the air like humidity before a storm. The psychiatrist had not yet delivered his report. He sat quietly, hands folded, observing. His testimony would not come until the following session. As the hearing adjourned for the day, Elena noticed something unexpected. Her father avoided her eyes, not with anger, but with uncertainty. For the first time, the narrative did not feel airtight. And somewhere beneath the polished performance of concern, a crack had begun to form. The morning of the psychiatric testimony arrived with an unnatural stillness. Even the sky seemed muted, wrapped in pale gray clouds that pressed low over the city. Elena felt it in her chest, not fear, but anticipation sharpened by exhaustion. Weeks of whispered accusations had drained her, yet something inside her remained untouched, unbroken. The courtroom filled more quickly than before. Word had spread through the extended family. An aunt who had not spoken to her in months now sat rigid in the back row. Her cousin scrolled nervously on his phone, pretending indifference. Elena noticed how their glances lingered on her just a moment too long, as if searching for visible signs of instability. Trembling hands, vacant eyes, erratic gestures. She gave them none. Her parents entered together, synchronized as always. Her mother carried tissues in her lap, prepared for quiet tears. Her father's jaw was tight, but not in anger, in calculation. Their strategy had been simple. Repeat the narrative until it felt like fact. Repetition creates reality. Or so they believed. When the court psychiatrist took the stand, the room shifted. He was measured, composed, unhurried. His presence lacked drama, yet it commanded attention. He had spent hours evaluating Elena. Clinical interviews, cognitive assessments, personality testing. He had reviewed documents, statements, timelines. His task was not emotional, it was analytical. Elena kept her gaze forward, though her heartbeat echoed in her ears. The psychiatrist began methodically. He described her mental state with careful language. Coherent thought processes, intact memory, stable mood presentation. He explained that emotional responses to stress did not equate to pathology. He emphasized that caring for an ill relative under family conflict was not evidence of instability. It was evidence of endurance. A murmur passed through the room. Then his tone shifted, not dramatic but firmer. He noted patterns in the submitted testimonies. Similar phrasing. Identical concerns repeated almost verbatim. He described what he called collaborative narrative shaping, a phenomenon in which close individuals unintentionally, or intentionally, reinforce a shared version of events until it overshadows objective observation. The words hung in the air. He stated clearly that he found no clinical basis for guardianship, no cognitive impairment, no psychiatric disorder that would justify removing autonomy or restricting access to inheritance. On the contrary, he observed signs of psychological resilience under prolonged relational stress. Elena felt something inside her chest loosen for the first time in months. Her mother's composure faltered. The tissues remained untouched, but her hand tightened around them. Her father's shoulders stiffened, as if bracing for impact. The psychiatrist concluded with a statement that shifted everything. Attempts to medically label normal emotional responses within family power struggles can themselves constitute psychological harm. Silence followed. Not the polite silence of procedure, but the stunned quiet of realization. In that moment, Elena understood that this was more than a legal victory. The manipulation had been named. Publicly. Officially. And once a lie is dissected under oath, it rarely survives intact. The silence that followed the psychiatrist's testimony did not dissolve when the session ended. It followed them into the corridor, into the elevator, into the cold marble lobby where echoes carried every footstep too clearly. Elena felt eyes on her again, but they were different now. Less pity, more confusion. The narrative had cracked. Her parents did not approach her immediately. They remained near their lawyer. Voices low, movements controlled. Her mother's face had hardened into something sharper than sorrow. The softness she had worn like a shawl in the courtroom had slipped, revealing a strain beneath it. Tight lips, restless fingers, a gaze that darted rather than settled. Elena stepped outside alone. The air felt colder than it had that morning. For months she had prepared to defend her sanity. She had not prepared for the quiet unraveling of her parents' composure. By evening, the extended family group chat, once filled with concerned messages about her well-being, had gone silent. No new check-ins. No cautious advice. Instead, isolated private messages began to appear. An aunt apologizing for misunderstanding. A cousin admitting he had felt pressured to sign a statement he never fully believed. A neighbor confessing she had only repeated what Elena's mother had told her. The pattern was emerging. Elena's lawyer called with updates. The judge had requested a deeper review of the evidence submitted by her parents, particularly the coordinated testimonies. What had once looked like corroboration now resembled orchestration. That evening, Elena returned to her grandmother's house. The old wooden floors creaked under her weight. Dust drifted in the amber light of sunset. She walked into the small study where important documents were kept, the place where the first whisper of inheritance had begun to twist into conflict. She found something unexpected. A folder tucked behind medical records. Inside were printed emails, messages her grandmother had forwarded to herself months earlier. Emails from Elena's mother. The tone was different from what had been presented in court. Less concern, more strategy. There were phrases about ensuring control and protecting family assets. There were discussions about timing, about influencing relatives' perceptions before legal paperwork was filed. Elena's hands remained steady as she read. This was no longer about misunderstanding. It was deliberate. The following hearing was brief but devastating. Under questioning, inconsistencies in her parents' timeline surfaced. Dates did not align. Incidents described as severe were revealed to be ordinary disagreements. The coordinated language across testimonies was highlighted. And then the judge requested the forwarded emails be entered into evidence. For the first time, Elena saw her father's certainty fracture. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a flicker, an awareness that control had slipped beyond recovery. The attempt to label her unstable had been strategic. But now the strategy itself was under examination. And as the courtroom adjourned once more, Elena understood something profound. The fight was no longer about proving her sanity. It was about exposing theirs. By the time the final hearing approached, the atmosphere around the case had shifted entirely. What had begun as a quiet concern about Elena's mental stability had transformed into a public dissection of intent. The whispers that once followed her through family gatherings now followed her parents through legal corridors. The courtroom felt heavier that morning, dense with expectation. Even the fluorescent lights seemed harsher, exposing every crease of tension on familiar faces. Elena noticed how distant relatives avoided sitting near her parents this time. Subtle physical distance had replaced blind loyalty. Her mother no longer carried tissues. Her father no longer projected composed authority. There was a tightness in his posture, a rigidity that suggested calculation rather than confidence. Their lawyer spoke less than before, choosing precision over performance. The forwarded emails were displayed on the courtroom screen. Sterile black text against white, stripped of emotion yet saturated with implication. Phrases about establishing instability before the will is finalized. Suggestions to document every emotional reaction. discussions about encouraging family members to observe and report unusual behavior. Each sentence landed with quiet force. Elena remained still, her hands folded in her lap. Months earlier, she would have felt the urge to defend herself. Now she felt something different: clarity. The psychiatrist's earlier testimony had done more than validate her sanity. It had shifted the psychological ground beneath the entire case. When questioned about the coordinated statements, her parents struggled to maintain coherence. Their explanations sounded rehearsed yet hollow. Concern had turned into strategy, strategy into exposure. Then came the most unexpected turn. The judge referenced the psychiatric report again, not only to dismiss the guardianship request, but to address the psychological harm caused by false allegations of instability. The court acknowledged the damage such narratives inflict on reputation, employment, and social standing. The word manipulation was spoken aloud. It echoed. Elena felt the weight of months lift slowly, not in triumph but in release. She realized the true cruelty of what had been attempted was not the inheritance itself. It was the erosion of identity. To be publicly framed as unstable is to have your reality questioned by everyone around you. It isolates. It diminishes. It rewrites memory. But the rewriting had failed. When the judge announced the dismissal of the guardianship petition and affirmed Elena's legal autonomy, the decision felt almost anticlimactic. The battle had already been won in the quiet unraveling of lies. Her parents did not look at her as the courtroom emptied. Their silence, once powerful and coordinated, now felt fractured and solitary. Outside, the afternoon light seemed brighter than usual. Elena stood on the courthouse steps again, but this time she felt grounded rather than hunted. Yet beneath the relief lingered a sobering truth. Victory does not restore what betrayal destroys. The final consequences had yet to unfold. The legal victory did not arrive with celebration. It arrived quietly, like snowfall in the early morning, soft, undeniable, and irreversible. In the weeks that followed the ruling, the official documents were finalized. The guardianship petition was permanently dismissed. Elena's autonomy was formally affirmed. The inheritance process resumed under her authority. But the true aftermath unfolded not in courtrooms, but in living rooms and phone calls that never came. Her parents withdrew into a silence different from before. It was no longer strategic. It was defensive. Invitations from extended family grew fewer for them. The same relatives who once expressed concern about Elena's mental fragility now avoided the subject entirely. Some offered her hesitant apologies. Others simply shifted their tone, speaking to her with new respect, as though sanity were something newly discovered rather than long possessed. Reputation, Elena learned, is fragile. But so is falsehood. The forwarded emails had done more than secure a legal win. They had exposed motive. The psychiatrist's testimony had done more than validate her stability. It had reframed the entire narrative. What had once been whispered as concern was now recognized as orchestration. Her grandmother passed away peacefully 3 months later. Elena sat beside her in the dim hospital room, holding a thin hand that had once guided her through childhood. There were no dramatic speeches, no last-minute revelations. Only quiet presence. Only dignity. When the will was formally read, there were no surprises. The house, modest savings, and personal belongings were entrusted to Elena, not as a reward, but as a continuation of care. Her parents attended the reading but said little. Their expressions were restrained, carefully neutral. Yet beneath the surface Elena sensed something unsettled. Not regret for losing control of the inheritance, but discomfort at losing control of the story. And that was the true inheritance. Months later, Elena began rebuilding parts of her life that had been placed on hold. Professional relationships stabilized. Social circles recovered. The label of instability faded, replaced by something stronger: resilience under public scrutiny. Occasionally, she replayed the courtroom moment when the psychiatrist had calmly dismantled the constructed narrative. Not with bitterness, but with clarity. It was the moment truth stopped defending itself and started revealing motive. She did not seek revenge. She did not confront her parents with accusations. Their exposure had been public, documented, and undeniable. Further conflict would only prolong a chapter that had already ended. Instead, she chose distance. The greatest consequence of their manipulation was not legal defeat. It was permanent fracture. Trust, once broken so deliberately, does not regenerate easily. On quiet evenings in her grandmother's old house, Elena would sit by the window and watch the light shift across the garden. She understood now that the attempt to strip her of custody, of inheritance, of autonomy had been rooted in fear. Fear of losing control, fear of irrelevance, fear disguised as protection. But fear cannot survive sustained examination. And when truth is spoken publicly, under oath, it becomes heavier than rumor and stronger than strategy. Her parents had tried to convince the world she was unstable. The court had disagreed. And in that disagreement, Elena reclaimed not only her inheritance, but her name.